I've worked the night shift at Greystone Cemetery for the past 3 years. At first, the job was as mundane as you'd expect. Patrol the grounds, keep an eye out for trespassers, maybe scare off a few kids trying to make ghost hunting videos. That all changed a few weeks ago. I was on my usual rounds around 2 a.m. when I noticed a light flickering in the old caretaker's cottage. It was odd because the place had been abandoned for decades, ever since the previous caretaker disappeared without a trace. Most of the staff avoided the cottage. There were rumors of strange things happening there, but I didn't believe in that kind of stuff. I was just a guy doing his job. So, I decided to check it out. The air was colder as I approached the cottage, or maybe it was just my nerves. The flickering light was coming from the small window near the front door. I hesitated, hand hovering over the doorknob, but then I reminded myself I was the night guard. This was my responsibility. The door creaked open, the sound echoing through the still night. Inside, the cottage was just as abandoned as I remembered. Dusty furniture, cobwebs in every corner, and a musty smell that clung to my nostrils. The light, that strange, flickering light, was coming from a small candle on the table. As I stepped closer, I noticed the candle was burned halfway down, as if someone had lit it hours ago. But there was no one here. I scanned the room, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. No signs of life, no footprints in the dust, nothing to suggest anyone had been here. And then I heard it. A faint sound like a soft thud coming from the other side of the room. My heart raced, and I spun around, flashlight searching for the source. But it was just an old bookshelf. A few books fallen onto the floor. Maybe they'd been dislodged by a draft or something. I decided to leave the cottage and head back to my rounds. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A small cracked mirror hanging on the wall. It was strange. I didn't remember seeing it before. I stepped closer, wiping away the grime with my sleeve. The reflection staring back at me was just me, tired and on edge. But something in my expression unsettled me. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the late hour messing with my head. Outside, the air felt normal again, the oppressive atmosphere of the cottage left behind. But the experience lingered in my mind. I avoided the cottage for the next few nights, sticking to my usual patrols. But then the strange occurrences didn't stop. Footsteps behind me when I was alone, shadows moving in the corners of my vision, and the sound of books or objects shifting when no one was around. I started losing sleep, the fear creeping into my every thought. I couldn't quit. I needed the job, needed the money, so I tried to ignore it, but the stress started to wear on me. One night, as I was doing my rounds near the older part of the cemetery, I noticed a grave I hadn't seen before. The headstone was weathered and cracked, the name barely legible. It was probably one of the older ones, neglected over the years. But the date caught my eye, 1957. How had I never noticed this grave before? I bent down to get a closer look, brushing away the dirt and debris. The name was hard to make out, but there was something familiar about it. Something that sent a chill down my spine. And then I heard a sound again. This time it wasn't a whisper or a thud, but something that made my blood run cold. The unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from behind. I shot up, spinning around. No one was there. But I could feel it now, that creeping sense of being watched. The stress, the lack of sleep, it was all catching up to me. I forced myself to stay calm, reminding myself it was just my imagination. But the feeling didn't leave. I hurried through the rest of my rounds, finishing up as quickly as possible. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that mirror, my own reflection staring back at me with an expression that wasn't quite right. The next day, I handed in my resignation. I couldn't keep doing this to myself. It wasn't worth it. But even after I left, the experience stayed with me. I know it was just stress, exhaustion, and maybe a bit of paranoia. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear those footsteps behind me. And I wonder if maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone out there after all. Story 2. I never imagined working the night shift would lead me to question my own sanity. But that's exactly what happened at the old industrial plant on the outskirts of town. When I got the job as a night security guard, it seemed like a simple gig. All I had to do was monitor the surveillance cameras, patrol the grounds, and ensure everything was locked up tight. The plant had been partially shut down for years, with only a skeleton crew maintaining the place during the day. At night, I was completely alone. My shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m., just before sunrise. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd make my rounds, check the cameras, and then settle in with a book or my phone to pass the time. The plant was huge, with long, dark corridors, vast, empty warehouses, and rows of machinery that hadn't been used in years. The place had a strange atmosphere, but I shrugged it off. Old buildings always felt a little eerie at night, especially when you were alone. But one night, about a week into the job, something changed. It was around 2 a.m. when I noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. I was watching the surveillance feed, flipping through the different camera angles, when I saw movement in one of the back warehouses. It was just a flicker at the edge of the screen, so quick I almost missed it. I rewound the footage, squinting at the grainy image. Nothing. But I was sure I'd seen something, maybe a rat or a stray cat. I told myself it was nothing to worry about, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my gut. I decided to check it out, just to be sure. The warehouse in question was at the far end of the plant, a massive, cavernous space filled with rusting machinery and stacks of old crates. The air was thick with dust, and the only sound was the echo of my footsteps as I walked through the dimly lit aisles. I shone my flashlight into every corner, but there was nothing there. Just the same old abandoned equipment and empty space. I was about to turn back when I heard it. A faint scraping sound like metal against concrete. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The sound was coming from deeper in the warehouse, somewhere out of sight. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move forward, following the sound. It grew louder, more distinct as I approached the back of the warehouse, and then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I stood there in the silence, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing. No one. I checked every inch of that warehouse, but I couldn't find anything that could have made that noise. I was on edge the rest of the night, every little sound putting me on high alert. But nothing else happened. The next night I tried to put the incident out of my mind. But as the hours dragged on, I found myself staring at the monitors, waiting for something to happen. And then, just after 2 a.m., it did. A movement, this time on a different camera. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I caught it. Something or someone was moving through the plant. My pulse quickened as I flipped through the camera feeds, trying to track the movement. But every time I thought I'd found something, it would disappear. Finally, I spotted it, a shadow, slipping between the machinery in one of the smaller workshops. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out, determined to catch whoever was messing with me. As I entered the workshop, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was faint but unmistakable. Oil mixed with something else, something metallic and sharp. I swept the room with my flashlight, every muscle in my body tense. But again, there was nothing. The room was empty, just like the warehouse had been. But then, I saw it. A smear on the floor, barely visible in the dim light. I crouched down to get a closer look. It was oil, mixed with something dark and sticky. Blood. My stomach churned as I followed the trail, leading out of the workshop and down a narrow corridor. The walls seemed to close in around me as I walked, the air thick and heavy. The trail led to a door at the end of the corridor, one I hadn't noticed before. It was slightly ajar, and as I approached, I could feel a cold draft seeping through the crack. I pushed the door open, my heart pounding in my chest. The room beyond was small, almost like a storage closet, but what I saw inside made my blood run cold. There, lying on the floor, was a man. No, a corpse. He was dressed in old oil-stained coveralls, his face pale and lifeless. The blood had pooled around him, mixing with the oil that soaked his clothes. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. This couldn't be real, but it was. I ran back to the security office, my hands shaking as I dialed the police. When they arrived, I led them to the body, barely able to speak. This time, the body was still there. The officers looked at me, then at each other, and called for backup. They cordoned off the area, and I spent the rest of the night answering questions, my mind racing. The police conducted an investigation, and it turned out the man was a former worker who had gone missing years ago. He had been living in the plant, hiding out, and something had gone horribly wrong. The plant was shut down for good after that, and I never worked a night shift again. But even now, I can't forget what I saw. Sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that faint scraping sound. And I know that somewhere, in the dark corridors of that abandoned plant, something is still there. Something that's been waiting for a long time. And it's not done yet.